And to answer this question, we'll hear from three of our community's foremost leaders on urban forests. They'll tell us why urban forests are important, what we need to have an urban forest, and how we get there from where we are at the moment. First up speaking tonight, we'll hear from Greg Moore, who's a renowned arborist, recipient of an Order of Australia medal for his services to the environment. And Greg will articulate the benefits of an urban forest. Then we'll hear from Jen Witheridge, who's the City of Port Phillip's urban forest specialist. And she'll talk to us about the urban forest strategy, which is in development at the City of Port Phillip. And finally, we'll hear from Gio Fitzpatrick, who's our local naturalist, a key player in transforming the old Elstonwick golf course into the beautiful Yallakawillam Nature Reserve that we have now. And after our speakers, we'll have time for Q&A. We'll have about half an hour there, so hold on to your questions. In that Q&A, we'll have probably about 15 minutes with Jen, and then she and the council folks need to leave as we talk about not council stuff, we talk about them, to them. So we'll get through that. Now, during that Q&A, or after the Q&A, we'll seek your endorsement as our community for a resolution that will go to council supporting the urban forest strategy. And we want a strong and expansive urban forest strategy from council so that we can avert one of those futures we saw. And speaking of urban forests, this year is actually the 50th anniversary of the urban forest on Canterbury Road here, which is a big milestone for Port Phillip, as it's one of our few, I'm not sure if we can describe it as remnant, but it's one of our few urban forests here. And I believe, Janet Colito, you're running a walk along there. Tickets are available on Wednesday, Thursday. So we are at a crucial juncture here in Port Phillip, in Victoria, in Australia, and in the entire world. You know, those of you who read the news might wonder what the hell we're doing. You know, we're in a bit of a mess at the moment. What we are in the middle of is a polycrisis. We have a world around us with rising inequality, failing democracies, hyperpolarisation, literal wars, mounting disasters, ecological collapse, and cost of living pressures that we feel here as well. And the climate crisis here in the middle of it makes all of these worse. And last year, global temperatures exceeded 1.7 degrees above baseline, you know, pre-industrial for the first time. So we're smashing past all of the guardrails, all of the targets that we have had and been working towards over the last 30 years. And the world's governments show no sign of taking any serious action that will forestall these climate impacts that we will face in the future. So, it's up to us to work locally to mitigate our emissions and all of our impact on the climate. But at the same time, we have to put in place adaptation measures that will mitigate and reduce the future impacts on our local community. And the best way that we can do this at a local area, apart from reducing all our emissions, is preparing our community for those impacts. And one of the key tools that we have to prepare our community is an urban forest. And the way that it does this is by transforming the City of Port Phillip into a livable, healthy and more resilient community. So tonight we're going to hear from, how our urban forests can help deliver these benefits for our community. Now right now, we're a long way from having an urban forest here in the City of Port Phillip. We're at 17-ish, 18% tree canopy. We're going to hear from Greg Moore where we need to get to. But our urban forest is among the lowest in Melbourne. And we have a choice here of whether we go towards, the red version of our future or the green version of our future. And this urban forest strategy and the urban forest work from the City of Port Phillip is that point where we can choose which direction we want to go in. Now, I'm not going to bore you any longer, because we have people here who are experts to tell us about what's happening. So I'm going to welcome to the stage here, would you all put your hands together for Dr. Greg Moore.
Good evening everyone. We'll just get the... Okay, just a few things to set the scene. First one, we're not in a green and leafy city. Melbourne is not a green and leafy city. You might think it is, you might think your suburb is, probably not. Most of our local government areas have a canopy cover under 20%, and much of it in the north and west of Melbourne, but as you know, some of it close by here, Benira and the like. Adelaide and Brisbane are greener than Melbourne, so we've been deluding ourselves a little bit, and we've really got to protect what we've got. It's not just about planting more, you've got to plant more, you've got to protect what we've got. Now, the other thing about climate change is most people, you think, know something about it these days, but it's amazing how often they don't put all the bits together. So, for example, if you ask Australians, it's going to be warmer? Yes. What about rainfall? Oh, we might get less rainfall. Is it going to be in the warmer months, so it's even a greater effect? They don't know that. And most people don't realise that if you warm up the atmosphere by 1 degree, there's a lot more energy in it. So what's that going to do? Stronger winds, more storms, cyclones moving southward. That's the sort of thing that happens. It's really very, very simple when you think about it, but we've not taken note of this, and it sort of catches us unaware. The urban heat island effect. Now, you folks know that as much as anyone. Urban heat island effect, how many degrees warmer is a concrete jungle, bitumen roads and the like than the surrounding green space? Well, it varies. It can be up to 5 to 6 degrees. And that urban heat island effect is really very, very significant issue. Okay, I think we just take it slightly slower. Clicking a bit fast, I think, moving through. So what you find is that green space is really important in terms of the urban heat island effect. And it's not just trees, but trees do things that others can't. Now, I'm guessing that, like most Australians, you're probably keen to have a bit of a shot at the local council. It seems to be an Australian pastime and sport. But in fact, when you look at the data, the trees growing on public land don't change much. So what's causing the problem in Melbourne? It's the loss of trees on private open space, front and backyards. And why are we losing that? For various reasons, but most of it's about development, isn't it? And renewal. And most of that is controlled by the state government. So you can bash your local council as much as you like on some of these issues. As soon as you cart them off to VCAT, you and the local council will be smacked around together because you agree what's happening is wrong, and the state government says, well, VCAT's made a decision. They don't tell you that they're the ones behind VCAT. So what you should be looking for, and I want you to take some messages home tonight, and 30% is going to come up. So if you remember that what we should be aspiring to is a 30% canopy cover, and I'll tell you why in a second, then I'll consider that I've had some success with you tonight. So 30%. What's the magic number? 30%. Thank you. So, urban heat island effect. Now, I always feel a bit sort of uneasy coming to this side of Melbourne, because I'm from the west, and we have urban heat island effects that are really quite spectacular. So you can see up the top that it's very hot in the northern western suburbs. Now, I take the view that by and large, if a few people die in a heat wave in the northern suburbs, no Victorian government is really interested, because they're not sort of electorates that are up for grabs at the next election. Now, I am being a bit black in my humour, okay, but that's the way I see it. So if it was just the case, nothing would be amiss. Few western suburbs people dead, what the matter. Now, unfortunately, when you have an urban heat island effect, at night, under most weather patterns, the hot air moves to the eastern suburbs and the southeastern suburbs. And most of you in this room, if you admit to yourself, you've been trying to figure out where you are in relation to these two maps, haven't you? First one, I'm okay, it doesn't affect me. Now you see the second one, oh God, I'm in trouble. That's happening at night. The nighttime temperatures that are the big issue, okay? And once you start looking at ambulance call-outs and hospitalisations, it's what happens at night that is really of concern. And people know this. When a prestigious scientific journal, like the Herald Sun, recognises for the first time that there is something going on in terms of climate change, and they did it in 2017. We've been talking about this 20 years then, and you notice what page they put it on? Page 23. But what they're actually saying, when you read the article, it basically says the lack of canopy cover in the western suburbs is going to cause people to die. Okay, that's basically what it is. And there's a very smart headline there, if you read it. Tree breeze blows. Leafy suburbs keep cool in summer. Sweltering west, green with envy. None of those sub-editors lived in the west of Melbourne, I can tell you that. Now, there are some interesting developments going on. And I'm only going to recent developments. And just before Christmas in 2022, the South Australian Parliament announced an inquiry into canopy cover of Adelaide. And they did so because Adelaide had lost 11% of its canopy cover in a decade and was losing 74,000 trees a year. Melbourne's worse, considerably worse. So why did the Adelaide Parliament decide to have a look at local government? And the answer is, in Adelaide, temperatures, once they get above 45, air conditioners, and here for that matter, air conditioners don't work so well, and the place becomes unlivable. So in a sense, the Adelaide, the state government in South Australia is acting because of the desperate impacts of climate change on their health system, on their costs. We're going into this, as it were, as a state, with the state governments, basically blind. We've been warned for decades, we've done nothing, and every time people die in a heat wave, everyone goes, oh geez, we didn't think that would happen. Well, yes, we bloody well did. Okay, and we should be up onto this. Next thing, New South Wales government, Gio will love this, they're putting natural capital into a sort of a framework. What does that mean? They put an economic value on a species, and the headline for this one is, what's a koala worth? Okay, you can imagine. And what this is doing, it's basically saying, in our societies, we don't take anything seriously until it's got a dollar value. Once you put a dollar value on it, then we'll start to sort of negotiate and think about our decisions and the consequences of it. We've been putting dollar values on trees, by the way, ornamental trees, for decades in Melbourne. And we have a Burnley method. Some of you will have used it. So this is not new to us, but it is new to others. And of course, the IPC reports pretty fearsome. Now in Victoria, can't we be proud of our environmental record? You know, the green state of Victoria, well, we were once. Boy, does it shame me as a Victorian that South Australia and New South Wales have better protection for their environments and their urban environments than we do. I don't go to Sydney anymore, I can't bear the shame. So, a couple of things here. Did you hear about the developer, and this is absolutely true, in Campbellfield, fined $225,000 for illegally removing trees. He then went to the Hume Council and said, I want to develop the site. The Hume Council said, you're a villain, you chopped down all the trees. We're not going to approve your permit. So he went to VCAT, and VCAT said, oh no, you can do it because there's no significant vegetation on the site, because the bugger had chopped them all down. Now, if you haven't caught up with this, this is the state you're living in. This happened late last year. And how the hell did that happen? It's immoral. It is immoral when you look at it. Now, a couple of other things. You may have missed this. The state government issued their report on the future of Melbourne. 5 options. Did you all catch this before Christmas? And the one that they've adopted for is using the same footprint, more intense development within that footprint. And some of you are going, yeah, that's good. And in many ways it is. Why did they adopt that strategy? Save us 43 billion, us Victorians, 43 billion. Sounds reasonable. Problem is, what about parks? Oh, there won't be any increase in parks. The same ratio of developed land to parkland that exists now will be what's available in the future. Although, what are there going to be extra people? We don't not worry about that. And what about trees in this report? It doesn't get a mention. So what was the headline? 43 billion. 43 billion. That's a lot of money. Well, it's not a lot of money when you look at what you're losing. It's a peanuts compared to what you're putting up in this sort of gamble. So I want to sort of make a couple of comments about that. We all know what climate change is going to do. At Victoria, cops are whacking. It's not our fault. Why is Victoria adversely affected by climate change? Because that's where we are. It's just bad luck. Some places in Australia not so badly affected. parts of Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, we cop it just because of where we are. And you know what that is going to be. I'm changing the clicker a bit quickly, so I'll have to slow down, my apologies. So, we know what's going to happen. It's going to be warmer, it's going to be drier. You're not going to be able to ski in the high country. Won't that break your bloody heart? So, what's the real impact of this, and where does it really matter? Did you know that 374 people died in the heat wave around Black Saturday? Double the number that were killed in the fire. The response to the fire was a royal commission. The response to the heat waves, this, was we don't do anything about the loss of vegetation in our cities. In 2014, there was a 3-day heat wave like we had last week. How many people died? Only 166. Okay, so you've got all this state government regulation about fire, but if people die from heat wave and increasing temperatures, well, that's just their bad luck. Is it? Is that the attitude we're going to take? So what we're talking about here tonight, in terms of your urban forest and in terms of your street trees, we are not talking about things that look pretty. We're not talking about ornaments in our environment. We're talking about matters of life and death. It's that serious. And the older you get, and the more you live in the western suburbs, the more a heat wave is likely to finish you off. It's as simple as that. So heat waves have other costs. You haven't probably realised it, but people have worked out when the temperature goes up, people get carted off in ambulances. They go to hospitals. Local surgeries are sort of come with demand. So it's not just the people that die, it's the cost to the health system of this sort of particular event, which is going to become more common, as we all know. Now, there are other health benefits of vegetation. Did you know that Australia could save $800 million a year if we had more green and leafy suburbs? Just in type 2 diabetes. You could save 4.2 billion a year in blood pressure and cardiac related diseases. Green and leafy suburbs. 5 billion a year. And the doctors and the epidemiologists who gave us this data said, it's not rocket science. You give people more green space with trees in it, they'll exercise more, they won't put on weight, and these are activity and exercise related conditions. It's as simple as that. But the problem is, we're not doing it. So, now you think about it, you're going to save $43 billion by having a development within the existing sort of framework of Melbourne, but you're going to be losing $5 billion just on these diseases alone every year. So in 10 years, your $43 billion is peanuts, okay? Because you haven't considered the health cost. You've looked at this in a one-dimensional way. Completely unacceptable. A study was done at the initiative of our health department, and what they wanted to know is what would happen to the health costs of Victoria, this is nearly 15 years ago, if 1 to 2% more Victorians exercised. They commissioned Deakin University to do the study, and Deakin came back and said, listen, people, you'll get your number, you'll get your increased exercises, as long as you provide them with green and leafy places to exercise, particularly in summer. They want shade in summer. And how much would you save at the time? $274 million a year off our health costs. That would be well over $400 million today. That is more than all the council parks and gardens departments in Victoria combined spend. Much more. So this is serious stuff. So here's my question for you. If you know all of this, we're still losing 1 to 1.5% canopy cover every year, mainly because of the redevelopment of private land. And this is going to cost us. 95% of the requests to remove trees in Victoria are ultimately approved. That's a better figure than the rest of Australia, by the way, where it's 97%. And so I say, if you know what trees do, and you don't protect them, you don't preserve them, and you don't get more of them, why isn't that negligence? Why isn't that negligence? And my suspicion is that sometime in the not too distant future, it will be negligence. Now, benefits of trees, loads of them, talk for weeks, be hauled off the stage. So, just a couple to finish up. First one, this study, my son is a medico, he sent me a copy of this study. It's a metadata study, and this is the title of this study. It's called The Effect of Greenness on Women's Health in North America. The Effect of Greenness on Women's Health. And what does greenness mean? We would call it treed green space. Treed green space. And some of these are really quite remarkable when you look at it. You'll see that people recover faster, they use fewer prescription drugs, their children, the birth weights of their children are higher, there's reduced social disadvantage, longer lifespans. If you go into hospital, you're not in as long, health costs decline. This is well documented, this is thousands of data items. The conclusions are correlative, but they're indisputable. We do this in Australia. People know this in Australia. Do you know we have little gardens in hospitals because if people are in hospital and they can see a plant, they don't have as many complications, they don't have the same number of infections, and they don't spend as much time in hospitals. So they allocate hugely valuable space to these gardens, and people say, why do they do that? And the answer is, because at the end, they save them money. Shopping centres, by the way, you probably don't have any strip shopping centres in your local municipal area, and I'm sure you wouldn't have any traders that would love to see a few street trees go for the extra car space. Okay, no pressure, Your Honour. Well, the interesting thing is, if you've got a strip footing shopping centre and you've got trees out the front, customers stay longer, they spend more, they're loyaler, they'll pay more for the same product, and if you're a woman with children, this applies at an even stronger level. So when traders start to pressure for the removal of street trees, all I can say is karma or Paul Kelly. Be careful what you wish for, you might get it. Okay, so just a couple of other things. It's interesting, it's going to be warmer, we're going to have stronger winds, we're going to have much stronger storms. All of this is going to have a really important impact. And we're here tonight to talk about the impact of the urban vegetation on climate change. So where I wanted to leave you is this. We're talking about this as the urban forest strategy. You don't have an urban forest. What do you need to have an urban forest? 30%. Why? Who said? Because a forest is defined in Australia, a forest has been defined for well over 70 years as trees with a canopy cover in excess of 30%. So, you think you've got an urban forest? Well, you haven't. Language matters. And what we've got, if we're lucky, is an urban woodland or open woodland. So I want to leave you with this point. 30%, I've mentioned it twice, I'm going to mention it another 3 times, it's the magic number. It's the number where you have a forest. It's the number where in an urban forest, if you get to 30%, the benefits go up, taper off because of the law of diminishing returns. So, the property value in Australia. Lyndall Platt did a brilliant study in Brisbane where she showed property value, same house, with or without trees, people spent more and more until the cover reached 30%. And then it went down. So people want trees, they don't want too many. And so, in answer to my final question, and I'm expecting to hear an answer, what should you be aiming for with your canopy cover? 30%. Thank you.
That number burned into your brains now. I'd like to take a moment here to welcome to the stage Jen Witheridge to talk to us about the City of Port Phillip's development of the Urban Forest Strategy. Welcome, Jen. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. We've got a few council members in the audience as well, so thank you also to your support. And if there's curly questions later, I can pass them over to a few other experts that we've got in the room as well. So I'd also like to pay my respects to our elders, past and present, of the traditional lands that we are today, with the people of the Kulin Nation. So I'd also like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here in the room with us today. So, going on from Greg's fabulous talk, tonight I thought I'd give you a snapshot of our urban forest here in Port Phillip and go through a couple of our key challenges. I'm going to focus on trees tonight, but I do want to note that we do consider vegetation and biodiversity as part of the urban forest. But we've also got Gio here tonight, and he'll be talking a lot about that, so I thought today I'd just focus on our trees. So what are we facing? So Port Phillip is the most dense municipality in Victoria. So we've got a population density of 5,029 people per square kilometre. High density apartments with more than three or more stories make up 55% of our housing stock, 4 times that of Greater Melbourne. 35% of our housing stock is medium or semi-detached, so not very much garden space, and only 7.7% of our housing stock is single dwellings with backyards. Future growth. We're looking at growth of over 40,000 people by the time we get to 2036. Our largest age bracket in the future is going to be people aged 30 to 44, and we're going to have more older people in our municipality. It's going to more than double in that time. So we have most of our housing stock, so most of the development approvals that we approve for new housing is apartment dwellings. So that's the stock that we're seeing in our city. So we have to think about how we can plan for great green cities that is also biodiverse and high density. And what that means is that as more people live in apartments, it means that our streets and our public spaces are going to be their backyards. It's going to be the places where people are out socialising. It's going to be the areas where we need to be really pulling their weight a lot in terms of our green places. They need to work harder, and they're going to need to be maintained more frequently. So we're also an urban municipality. It means that it's actually really hard on trees. And also finding space for them is really challenging. So you can see, this is a great slide from Maribyrnong City Council. You can see the contested space that we've got where we're trying to plant trees. So it's really, really, really tricky for them to establish and for them to grow well when they've got all of these conflicts. About 50% of our trees, of our street trees in Port Phillip, have electric lines over the top of them. They're surrounded by power lines as well. So before I go into this next section, what's the magic number that Greg was talking about? Thanks, Greg. So our canopy cover overall. Anyone here from Elwood? You guys are fine. And so what we've done a detailed canopy analysis. We did this in 2022. We used aerial photography with high definition, and we also used LiDAR data as well, which gives us tree heights. So we've got really good canopy data going back to 2012. We've mapped the change. So what we've seen is that in those 10 years, we have had a decline in our canopy cover by about 1.7%. All of that loss has come from trees on private land, and it's been our street trees which have been pulling more of their weight and trying to keep that canopy cover. So, streets. You can see that lots of our streets actually have around 25-26% canopy cover. Elwood, you're at 39. That's fabulous. But there are some issues there that I'll get to in the future. And you can see that Sandridge and Wirraway, and Montague, they're our fishermen's bend suburbs. We're going to have 60,000 people moving in there over the next 50 years or so. They've got our lowest level of canopy cover. you can see our public space. On public spaces, we do have, sports ovals and things like that, so areas where we can't plant trees. But what we've found is that areas where we can plant trees on public space, our canopy cover is actually quite good. Private space. So you can see that we're kind of in the red and the orange zones here. And in our Fisherman's Bend suburbs, there really aren't any trees on private land at the moment. So we know that our community wants really high canopy cover. So in the engagement that we've done throughout the last 12 months, we know that people really support a high level of canopy cover targets. We know that people are really interested in doing their bit on their own land and in community plantings and on streets. And we know that people want more protections for trees on private land in our regulations, in our planning scheme, in our local laws as well. So when we look at the gap of canopy cover of where we are now to where we need to be, we've done a few quick exercises to work out what our challenge actually is. So what we did is we took a typical small tree and a typical large tree. So small trees, we've got crepe myrtles, we've got the beautiful eucalyptus platypus. They're typical small trees in our municipality. Large trees, we've got London planes, we've got the beautiful lemon-scented gum, Corumbia citrador. They're quite big. So that's the kind of average canopy cover we get on our trees in Port Phillip for small trees and large trees. So we can use this to work out, if we want to get to 30% canopy cover or more, how many trees do we have to plant? On streets, if we want to get to 30% canopy cover, we need to plant just over 4,500 small trees or just over 2,000 large trees. On private land, to get to 30% canopy cover, we have to plant almost 20,000 small trees or about 10,000 large trees. If we want to push that further and get it up to 40%, we're looking at needing almost 50,000 small trees on private land. So this data provides a really useful indicator of the scale of work required to improve our canopy coverage. However, it shouldn't be taken as a reflection of the trees we can actually plant in the ground. So, for example, if we think of wider streets in South Melbourne and Port Melbourne, that might mean that we can't achieve 30 or 40% canopy coverage due to the trees not being able to shade that full width of street. In St Kilda East, Balaclava, we might struggle to find adequate space for the number of trees required due to driveways, really narrow road reserves, footpaths, and all of the underground and above ground infrastructure. On private land, we're really dense. We're a really dense municipality, and that's going to increase. We've got building envelopes, built form, and lot size will influence the availability of space to plant trees. So we've got lots of small lots with small garden areas. We've got lots of apartment buildings which restrict space for tree planting. And so there's a lot of complexity that we have to deal with. And I'm sorry that that's so depressing, but this is our challenge. But what can we do? And where can we focus our actions? So we need to plant trees where they're going to matter most. So we can provide greater equity within our municipality by focusing our tree canopy on key pedestrian areas so that people can walk with comfort, particularly people who rely on public transport, who use community transport, and for children along key walking routes, and so that people can walk to activity centres so that they don't need to drive. We can ensure that our neighbourhoods have cool, shady areas in parks and reserves. So with good management, including tree and vegetation planting, irrigation, access to drinking water, these areas have the potential to become cool refuges during hot weather. So you can see in the Parks and Reserves section, so we've just done some canopy estimates there of some of our typical kinds of parks and reserves in Port Phillip. When you take away areas for sports fields and areas where skydivers like to land, we have actually quite good canopy coverage. So we do need to balance open space, clear open space, and also true canopy cover in our parks. But in lots of areas we are pushing 45, 50% around our public transport areas as well. So we're working with the Walkability Project, which is a research partnership with Swinburne and Melbourne universities, and there's a few municipalities, including Glenara, who are a part of this, to assess shade on our footpaths in summer afternoons. So if you think of a tree canopy, when the sun comes and hits it, the shade isn't going to be directly above it. So what they've done is they've modelled where the shade of the tree actually falls. And so working with them, we've now got a model where we know which of our footpaths are in shade on hot summer afternoons and which are in sun. And we're about to go through and make all of our bus stops and transport stops and community bus stops on that so that we can focus our tree planting. That was really exciting. I'm so excited about that. All right, tree diversity. So we've got more than 46,000 trees. 75% of those are street trees. There's a general benchmark, which is the 10-20-30 rule. So this is that you want diversity of your species, diversity of your genus. So a species is like, say, Eucalyptus platypus. Platypus is the species, Eucalyptus is the genus, so it's the broader group, and then of the family. And so some councils around Australia and around the world have modified that a little bit. So for example, the City of Melbourne has a target to increase urban forest diversity with no more than 5% of any one tree species, 10% of any genus, and 20% of any family. So we're actually not doing too badly. So we have a fair rating for species and family and a good rating for genus. So what's letting us down? So family, it's the Myrtaceae family. So that's not surprising in Australia. So the 10-20-30 rule is originally was developed in America. They don't have eucalypts and gums in the Myrtaceae family, which is a really, really, really big family. But we do. And so around 30% for the Myrtaceae family is pretty good. For species, our plane trees are at 9% of our tree canopy. But everything else, we're looking really, really good for our species diversity. So plane trees. Elwood, this is your issue. 85% of your tree canopy is plane trees in Elwood. So the health and structure and useful life expectancy of the trees in our urban forest provide crucial information so we can best manage our urban forest. We've got good technology now that assists us, and we audit our trees every year, and we can utilise the data that we have to ensure we can optimise the health and canopy potential in our trees. But there's risks and there's things that we have to manage. So there's a few things that we could talk about, but I'm just going to use plane trees as an example because it's one of our biggest issues. So average age of our plane tree is about 60 years old. Over half are planted on power lines. Plane trees are loved for their excellent canopy, shade, autumn colour, and they're equally unloved for their leaf drop and for their allergen properties. And also, if you live near a plane tree, there's also root issues as well. They have very vigorous roots and they like to find moisture. And so we also have lots of requests for root barriers for our plane trees, with private residences from root barriers on street tree plane trees to stop them getting invasive. So while plane trees are generally very hardy, they're susceptible to anthracnose, which is a fungal disease. And we have a lot of anthracnose coming through every year. So some years we have maybe 50% of our plane trees infected. We've also been seeing outbreaks of powdery mildew at the moment, particularly on our younger baby trees that we've planted. So we monitor for disease, and we treat them carefully to try and reduce their stress. But plane trees are also susceptible to leaf drop in drought and heat waves. And what plane trees do, if they've had an anthracnose infection or if they've had stress due to heat, they drop their leaves. So they've used up all of their energy to grow new leaves, they get stressed, they drop it. If that happens kind of throughout summer, they might try again to do a new leaf push and grow new leaves, but they're deciduous, and so then they lose them again. And so what that means is that we get this steady cycle of stress and ultimate leading to decline in our plane trees. Also, 50% of them are under power lines, which means that we have to chop them. That's another added stress. So plane trees in Port Phillip add significant value to the character of our streets, of our gardens, of our properties. But we need to think about how we can best manage and enhance the leafy character of our neighbourhoods and manage the current and future challenges associated with our stock of plane trees. So if we want to minimise the risk going forward, we've got to deal with this issue. I'm a Canberran originally, and I know that there are so many beautiful, large, big leafy tree species that we could start to introduce to diversify this forest. There's so many, and they're beautiful. But we want to keep our leafy character of our suburbs. We don't want to lose that. But some of the great things that we're doing, so that was all very doom and gloomy, but some of our current projects, so we've got Healthy Tracks to School, so this is in collaboration with our transport safety team. So they're working with local schools to identify how we can make walking and riding to school more safe, more happy, and a healthier experience. And so far, Port Phillip's worked with, I think, 5 to 6 schools. So what we've looked at is the schools have identified the main walking routes that their kids use to get to school. We've audited the ones that we've done so far, and for canopy cover, and we're filling in those gaps with new trees. And as that program rolls out, we're continuing to do that. We've just joined the My Smart Garden program. We kicked off our first event series last Thursday with a habitat gardening demonstration. It's available as an online resource, or will be, when the editing's finished. We were also partnering with the Seeds to Success program, and so this is a program with TreeNet and Speciality Trees. So TreeNet is like a great organisation Australia-wide, and Speciality Trees is our growing partner, our nursery. And so this is trialling new species of trees with lots of local councils to see which new species we can get growing best. The picture of that gorgeous wattle there is an acacia bignevia. That one in particular was identified by one of our project managers, and she got the nursery to collect seed, and we've propagated a lot, like over 100 of them, because they're an excellent wattle that's really well suited to our environment, and we've got lots of stock from other species coming through that we're adding as well. But the other best resource we have is you guys, it's our community. So up there is a list of some of the community focus groups and organisations that we have. That really, as Greg said, private property is a really big issue for canopy cover. But the more engaged community we have and the more we can work together, we're going to get the best outcomes. So I'm really looking forward to working with you all. We've got our urban draft urban forest strategy in draft at the moment. It'll be coming out for community engagement later, kind of soon. We've also got a Have Your Say page. It's got a lot of information on it, so around canopy cover, around biodiversity, around current planning regulations we've got on private land. So have a look on that webpage. It's got lots and lots of information, and we really look forward to your feedback on that coming up. Thank you.
Cool. I wanted to start here and also mention that biodiversity is almost always a sort of intended or implied beneficiary of urban forest strategies. But how do we actually achieve those outcomes in the nitty-gritty? Often I see a lot of energy put towards by the community in advocacy put towards getting good outcomes for biodiversity, but I often see it fall apart through the process. And so this is hopefully going to be useful for some of you who want to advocate and see these things through, but also enact some of that advice in your garden potentially. And of course we're on Woonwurrung land here, and they cared for country for a very long time, and now it's up to us to care for country. And what might that look like in our context? It's a tough and complicated question, but I think it's a really important thing to think carefully about. And starting here, I took this photo about a week ago on a patch of land that is in an earlier state than our home environment. It's actually yet to be developed, but the tree that white goshawk is sitting in has a blue spot on it, which means it's set to be cut down pretty soon, as are hundreds of trees all around it. It's going to be a retirement village very soon, and it's incredibly sad. And the view that those residents in that retirement village will get when they look up at the same place that we're looking at there is that, which is a very, very sad thing, and I think a needless situation as well. On that same block, it's just been removed, but there was a drooping she oak, which is a local plant for here, and on it was a drooping mistletoe, which is a very specialised plant that lives in the canopy of other trees. And for a drooping mistletoe, it's only got a handful of potential hosts that it can actually grow on. And how did it get there? It was dropped by a mistletoe bird, which eats almost nothing else. And the seed of drooping mistletoe is so sticky that a mistletoe bird has to actually wipe its bum on the branch to remove it. So it's no accident that that mistletoe ended up there. And then you can see the caterpillars of spotted Jezebel butterflies, which live on just a very small number of local native mistletoes. And there you can see that beautiful butterfly there. A super intimate relationship across many species there, because they've co-evolved. They've been living together for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. And that is very normal in nature. It might seem incredibly well specialised, but it's normal. And here you can see imperial blue butterfly caterpillars being attended by Iridomyrmex ants. And what I mean there is the caterpillars go about their day feeding on, they prefer black and silver wattles locally, and particularly young trees. That's what their parents are looking for when they lay their eggs. As they go around, they are protected from predators and parasites by these ants, and the caterpillars can actually produce a range of sounds and smells that tell the ants exactly what they need. But to have that situation, you need that particular plant at that particular age to be there, and you need those ants there as well. And I'll say it again, this kind of specialised interaction is actually what nature is built from. It's millions and millions of these specialised interactions for the most part. This is the rule, not the exception, although it might seem amazing. And that's the adult butterfly there looking for a spot on that wattle. Here's another one taken locally, a pallid cuckoo that was passing through. Thank goodness there was a drooping she oak there on the old foreshore, because it found one of its favourite foods. Pallid cuckoos are a specialist at eating furry caterpillars, and they do so by, they can handle those irritating hairs by actually removing the lining of their stomach at regular intervals to get rid of the hairs. One of the few birds that can eat those caterpillars. And that is not just any caterpillar, that is a she oak moth. It's another specialised critter that is only there because there's the right tree. And caterpillars, I wanted to point out, they're a really good kind of indicator, or I suppose benchmark, for how an ecosystem is faring, because, well, we pretty much all, I assume, know that invertebrates are pretty important. Someone once said they're the little things that run the world, but if you were to narrow it down, caterpillars are transforming more plant tissue into animal tissue than any other group of animals on the planet. So they are the most important linkage in terrestrial ecosystems, because those plants are producing energy, but if it's not going into an animal, then it doesn't cycle through the food web, it doesn't cycle through an ecosystem. You've got a dead end in the food web. So caterpillars are particularly important, and there'll be a bit of a theme through this. Now, all those specialised interactions that I mentioned that nature is basically built from, what do you think happens to them when we do this to the landscape? They're gone, virtually destroyed. And it might look lovely and green and probably cool under there, but unfortunately it's a green desert. And I think it is entirely possible to achieve all of the outcomes that we want to achieve in terms of aesthetics and in terms of the microclimate outcomes, while also having a high portion of indigenous plants back in the landscape. So we're going to talk about that. Now, a bit more on why it's a green desert. Well, there was this study in the US. It's the best we've got. We don't have equivalent studies here yet, hopefully soon. But it looked at the species richness of caterpillars in native hedgerows and in invaded hedgerows. What that means is occupied by non-indigenous plants. The species richness was reduced by 68%, which is pretty significant if you think of all the things that are in there looking for caterpillars to eat. The abundance went down even more, 91%. But then the real hit in terms of, if you're, say, a bird looking for food, have a look at the biomass of caterpillars in non-indigenous plants versus native plants. It's a 96% reduction. It's basically an untenable situation for a lot of species. And that's kind of what we've replicated everywhere. And the reason for that, I've probably covered it enough, but this is a useful quote. 90% of the insects that eat plants, and actually most of the world's insects are plant eaters, can only develop and reproduce on plants with which they share an evolutionary history. So if we're not planting those plants, then we're not fostering much insect life, and if we're not doing that, then it's a bit of a stuffed ecosystem. And the situation locally really reflects the situation globally, unfortunately. So across 16 studies, insects have declined by 45% since 1970. And it's because of things like that. Here's a few headlines which should spark us into action. And I'm hoping tonight is a chance for action. But you might say, why are we in a biodiversity crisis if we've got reserves there to do the job of protecting biodiversity for us? This is a local reserve, a beautiful heathland sanctuary, which I've visited many, many times. It is fantastic in its own right, but you can kind of see the problem. It's self-evident. And that's a small reserve, but believe it or not, the same problem besets all reserves. No matter how big they are isolated in islands. And if we're not going to acknowledge the needs for biodiversity in all the places in between, they will remain islands. And what happens to islands of habitat? Well, thankfully, nature had a long-running experiment before us Europeans even got here. Pristine habitat in many respects, French island. Fantastic habitat for a range of native species, but just by its isolation, even though that is a huge piece of land, you would think that would be like an ark for biodiversity. If that was a national park, you'd think it's pretty all right. But have a look, over time, the things that French island lost before we even made it here, just by its isolation. Lace monitor, southern brown bandicoot, long-nosed bandicoot, swamp wallaby, Tasmanian pademelon, spot-tailed quoll, eastern bettong, powerful owl, masked owl, all of these species missing from perfectly good habitat purely because of its isolation. And that situation is actually what our entire reserve system the world over is based on. And that's our hope for saving biodiversity, unless we step in the places in between, which is something we absolutely can do. So we need to find ways to connect up the landscape. We desperately need to do that. And this seems like the perfect opportunity, talking about urban forests. Now, another reason that the reserves are beset by problems is we're very selective about where we put them, and it doesn't tend to be in the places where biodiversity needs them most. So have a look at the distribution of booboks there across Australia, super widespread across a range of habitats, but avoiding that little kidney-shaped part of the western part of the continent there. And you'll see that pattern repeated again and again. It's a particularly impoverished part of the continent for fairly obvious reasons. It's very, very harsh. There's even more species following that general pattern. So if we were creating a reserve system that was representative of continental biodiversity, we would be putting it in those blue areas, but instead it's the reverse. And that happens at a small scale too. So the most productive land, the big rivers, those sorts of areas, which are really, really useful for biodiversity, are the same places that we centre our cities. And that means that we are competing for the same land for the most part as wildlife. Which means if we're going to save wildlife, we've got to find ways to live with it. And not just have it survive and hang on in little pockets, but actually thrive in our environments that we're presented with. We've got to let go of the idea that humans and nature can be separated. As long, I think anyway, as long as we keep trying to separate it out, it's going to get an insignificant amount of land that is not adequate to sustain it. So it's not just good for us, but it's also critical for wider conservation that we encourage life into our environments. And wildlife is trying really hard to hold up its end of that agreement. This pobblebomb had actually surfed 8 kilometres down a stormwater drain from the nearest population. Well, not one of the nearest, but a population that's connected by that stormwater system. Likely come all the way from Karkaruk Park, which is a fairly substantial population. They're now locally extinct in the city of Port Phillip. Believe it or not, the last population survived around a leaky pipe next to a sport oval. They're not hard to accommodate. When that leak was fixed, they went locally extinct in our municipality. But they are still coming down those drains from far off populations, and they're finding no usable habitat. Bird migration's another one that should get us thinking. Again, in the US, there was an interesting study looked at tropical migrants that head to temperate areas during the boreal summer, and they found that the breeding success of birds on migration increases. So those that stay put in the tropical areas that are stable all year round and are full of competitors, they tend to raise 2 to 4 young on average, whereas those that migrate tended to raise 3 to 6. And that's the difference that justifies all of that effort for those little birds flying those enormous distances, a lot of them dying along the way, is the reward in that there's a lot more food available to them when they arrive in the temperate zones. And that is now being questioned as to whether that's still the case because of the changes to those landscapes. So it is possible that migration for a lot of these species is an anachronism now, that those benefits are no longer there awaiting them, but their evolutionary history still tells them to migrate. That's something that we should work at fixing, because that's very sad, in my opinion. And we're seeing a similar thing happening here. So I'll actually skip back and just mention quickly Rufus fantail. This was taken in an Elwood backyard by Andrew McCutcheon, if any of you know him. Is that right? I think so. Anyway, and it's a bird, Rufus fantail, which lives during the winter as far as Papua New Guinea, but at least far north Queensland. And they're travelling through our landscapes. Recently, this is just in the last week, I've been seeing people reporting them moving through. At this time of year, they're heading north. They're trying to get back up to far north Queensland and Papua New Guinea, and they're coming across our environment on the way through. There's one in ACDC Lane and another one somewhere in the city of Bayside. And the prospect for these birds is probably pretty poor. You don't often see rufous fantails hanging out on the ground. When birds stop on migration, they're stopping to refuel. They're not stopping to rest. They need food desperately, and our environments are not providing that food for them anymore. This is a bird that should have been breeding locally. It shouldn't have just been on passage through our area. It should have been breeding in the gullies. Here's another one, painted button quail. This is in my friend's backyard in Elwood. The amazing thing is we still have incredible birds and other wildlife falling out of the sky, raining down on our landscape, and that is a very precious gift which we shouldn't take for granted. That means that there is still a window of opportunity to turn things around. That means if we did something, there would be a response, but that won't always be the case, and we should take advantage of this situation. At the moment when things like this land here, they don't find the habitat to sustain them for any length of time. But it'll take seeing urban environments in a new light. So some of us might have a hard time actually imagining how wildlife fits into a space like that. But actually wildlife is far more pragmatic. As far as they're concerned, all those buildings might as well just be boulders. You can ignore them. But it's what's in between that's important, and that's where we're falling short. That's where we can make big improvements. Now, also, in terms of our sense of place, I'll actually just go back one moment and say, the cities all over the world, the cars all over the world sound much the same. But the birds can tell you a bit of a deeper story about where you really are, a story that goes back millions of years. And a lot of us won't even know what we're missing out on, but it's an incredibly joyous thing to work on bringing it back. But more on that sense of place, does anyone recognise this part of Melbourne? Yeah, exactly, but it could easily, if you looked at the trees and the plantings, but well spotted, it is London. That's taken from the top of one of those double-decker buses. But largely our plantings are emulating that, which is a great shame. This is a part of an integral part of the character of Melbourne, just as plane trees are. But do we want to be repeating that over and over again everywhere? I don't know. It's up to you. Speaking of sense of place, when we plant what we call natives from other parts of the continent, they behave ecologically much the same as those plane trees, for example, that we brought from overseas. There might be some very simple interactions, say some birds or other things might feed on the nectar. That's, as far as the contribution by a plant goes, that is really surface level. Remember, it's the insects feeding on the leaves that are transforming those tissues into proteins that can be used by other species. And when we plant that in gardens in Melbourne and call it native, I wonder what a Bunurong person would think if you had to cross 16 different nations in order to see that plant. Would they have called it native? No, I don't think so. And it's the same as if you had a garden in Germany and you wanted to plant all natives and you chose plants that came from Syria. It's the same distance. So we've got to watch out for that mistake there. And there's another way to measure things too. Obviously, origin can be a bit arbitrary if we're trying to rebuild ecosystems. What about the functionality of those plants? Well, it turns out that there's about a 65% reduction in caterpillar abundance on non-native plants even when they belong to the same genus as some of our local native plants. There's still a huge reduction in how much those plants are keyed into the local food web. So when we plant, and this is not directed at you, Jen, but it's been done for years and years, and often by people with really good intentions. We plant non-native natives. And there's a few things that go wrong there. Not only are they not performing the roles they should, but oftentimes we choose those species which have a disproportionate production of nectar or other sugary exudates, because again it's that surface level thinking about habitat value, and what you get as an outcome more often than not is an overpopulation of those birds which are most aggressive and actually reduce the bird community diversity even further. And that's certainly been done in a lot of places, so we've got to watch out for that one. And once we factor all this in, it will impact our plant choices, I hope. And we might start to see other plants considered, at least considered. This is my neighbour who had a black wattle just self-seed in his front yard, and their seeds can last in the soil for 60 years. And thankfully he didn't weed it out when it was a little seedling. It's now this spectacular specimen. And during the Black Summer fires and after, for weeks on end, we had flocks of yellow-tailed black cockatoos landing in that tree. It's the only one for half a kilometre around. Somehow they recognised it, knew it was a food plant, because there are grubs that live under the bark of those trees that they like to feed on. But it's also important for a range of reasons. It's a standout in terms of that food web contribution. It's associated with 2,000 invertebrate species in Melbourne, and up to 700 species have been found on a single tree. So a black wattle, might be a short-lived tree. It might only live 20 years if it's doing well. But in that time, it's hosting more biodiversity than every plane tree in Melbourne will for the next 200 years. It could easily be said. So if we're factoring that in, maybe we can put up with a short-lived tree. It's also an extremely fast-growing tree, is the flip side of that. More moths and butterflies than any other local tree, more mistletoe species than any other local tree, and a food plant for sugar gliders, which are a locally extinct mammal, but if we had the right trees in the landscape, they should be quite adaptable. In fact, where you do have the right trees in urban areas, around Mount Eliza and in some of the inner northeast, there are sugar gliders surviving and just gliding over the rooftops as though they were in any other forest. Here's London again. If anybody was wondering if maybe our local indigenous plants just aren't up to the task of being street trees, well, there's a silver wattle in London looking amazing when all of their deciduous trees are looking dead. I would like that. I would like to see that, even if I wasn't thinking about wildlife. That's a pretty tree that I think we should be using more, and it's almost equivalent to black wattle in terms of its ecological contribution locally, but longer lived. So maybe it's got its place in some areas where we can't use black wattle. We're still planting things like this. So very similar in its ecology. It's an early sort of succession colonist, this plant, but it's silver birch. We could be swapping things like that out for silver wattles quite easily. Blackwood as well. This is a really long-lived acacia. Doesn't have as many insect associations, but still far and away more than actually most indigenous trees, and also obviously all non-indigenous trees. And here's one looking absolutely beautiful on this narrow street in San Francisco. But we're not planting them very often here. They've recognised the beauty and the use of these trees. Ironically, that's not going to be doing a whole lot for biodiversity over there. And here's one that I photographed. They can get to a really substantial size and cast beautiful shade. Here's drooping she oaks used in Torquay, another fantastic shade tree. Drooping she oaks are probably second to black wattle as amazing producers of insect diversity. If you watch birds on migration, particularly smaller insect-eating birds in our local area, if you're anywhere near a she oak, you will see it's like a magnet for things like grey fantails and brown thornbills. And it's not producing, critically, a whole lot of that nectar. It's counteracting that issue that we've been sort of fostering since the 70s of planting showy natives. And I should say, if I've got time, just briefly, insects and seeds are a resource used by birds, but they're not a resource that can really be defended. Nectar has this tendency to foster aggression because it's a reliable resource. Once a bird has drunk some nectar from a flower, it knows that if it can defend that portion of a tree or that tree, there's going to be more nectar on the way. You can't do that with insects and seeds. So there's a vast array of birds locally that are specialised at eating insects, and they live together quite happily. Here's a lightwood, fairly recently planted, another really fast-growing one. Tolerates a bit more dryness than blackwoods. Oaks and black wattles, they occur on the sunny north-facing slopes of the Yuyangs. They'll be all right through climate change in our environment close to the coast, at least for a fair while. And there's a black wattle. You rarely see them planted as a street tree, but here it is. Unfortunately, it's another one under power lines, but it seems to be doing reasonably well. The brush box is sort of a bit more hampered by the pruning, it seems, in fact, than the black wattle, and that's less than 10 years old, that tree. Already forming a really interesting contribution. So we should see plants like that, those really important ecological players. If we were building a house, they're like the 2x4 in that ecological house, and the word ecology comes from the study of the home anyway. But they are the foundations that hold everything up. They're load bearing. So these sort of plants. And the reason that they're so well used, the most important reason, is that they were really significant components of the original landscape in southeast Melbourne. These sort of dominated the landscape, and that's why they've got the most associations, for the most part. But now they're very rare to see. We've been building our ecological home out of wallpaper so far, so it's no surprise that it's in a bit of disarray. And these are some of the typical things. You'll notice I've got the non-native natives alongside all of those things that we generally don't consider native. Now into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty. Here's two indigenous plant species used side by side in a way that might actually detract from the value of them. And I'll explain why. So this she oak, as I said, fantastic producer of all of these specialised insects. Look at how they resemble the cladodes on the she oak. You can assume from that they probably eat nothing else. And then you've got the flatbug nymphs or psyllid nymphs that then become food for the lacewing larva, that then becomes food for hungry hornbill, and the she oak moth that we saw earlier as well. But my point here is, remember I mentioned that issue of overproduction of nectar in our local food webs? Well, these Banksias are going to bring in little wattle birds, probably, that are going to prevent any of these being of any use, things like brown hornbills and that sort of thing. So really the big shift that we've got to try and work on creating in our local food webs is to create more of that, the insect production, and pare back a little bit on the sugary exudates, because the lack of insects and the abundance of nectar are together creating an issue that you can see here. I wonder how I'll play this actually. Is there a way? I'll probably just press that. Here's a bit of vision from the Yellowkit Willam Nature Reserve. That's a pardalote there it's a dead one that I've taped up in a tree to show the response of noisy miners to just a small bird just sitting on a branch. So this is now the situation that is quite dramatic. So that speaker's there playing the calls of pardalotes. Pretty much shows that it's impossible for a lot of small birds to live in our parks now. And it's no surprise that you go around parks and it's impossible to see a bird smaller than a noisy miner for the most part. And I'll explain a little bit as to why, if I can. Okay. So this is a really simple set of graphs. The orange is the proportion of the bird community that's under 60 grams, which is the average weight of a miner. So we're seeing across many different situations, there's your classic eucalypt-dominated open grass park that noisy miners just love. Similar situation at the Yellowkit Willam Nature Reserve. George Street Reserve is a remnant heathland where there never would have been noisy miners before. It's actually the worst performer of all. There were no other bird species other than noisy miner there in two 20-minute long surveys Doesn't mean there's never any other birds there, but it's a pretty strong indication that it's faring very poorly. Very slight outlier here, Albert Park, St Kilda Botanic Gardens. This is a pretty dire state. I'll show you what parks, urban parks, similar to this, but without noisy miners look like. This is looking much better. This is in Royal Park, again Royal Park, which for the most part is noisy miner dominated, but not this little corner. This is a foreshore reserve in Brighton, a totally exotic dominated, so introduced plant dominated garden there in the Ripponlea estate, jawbone flora and fauna reserve, and a pretty average backyard in the local area. All of them performing much better than most of our big open parks, which is really interesting. And then if we look at more intact habitats, that's what they should be. So it should be dominated by those small bush birds. Here you've got a dry woodland or forest, greens bush a little bit on the damper side, temperate rainforest, open grassy woodland, almost treeless western treatment plant. So it's not just a tree canopy story, and heathland as well, which this heathland is more or less treeless too. So across a range of habitats, it almost doesn't matter what type, they should be dominated by those small birds, and our local environments are the other way around. If I just remind you there what they look like. And this is a brown thornbill in my garden. My garden has more small birds in it, usually, than the entire Yallourn Willam Nature Reserve, 13 hectares of nature reserve. Which means we have a huge opportunity and a responsibility. The choice of what we plant in our streets and gardens is what's going to make the difference for these things more than anywhere. You can create all the habitat you like in a noisy miner-dominated parkland. It's not going to make a big difference, but the fact that our streets and gardens don't have a huge issue with noisy miners compared to the parks means that if you plant something like the Coria reflexa for an eastern spinebill, like I have in my garden in a pot, they will find it and use it. That's exactly what's happened at my place. I go to some parks where there's hundreds of Corias and not a single spinebill because they just can't use them. I have a river red gum out the back of my place which has a resident pair of spotted pardalets and they nest every year. There are hundreds of red gums between Elsternwick Park South and the Yallourn Willam Nature Reserve. No nesting pardalets there. So this is a pretty critical thing to get right in our design. And one thing we've really got going for us, I reckon, in this pursuit is that nature is very good and very keen to restore itself if we give it half a chance. Almost done? Yeah. That's good. I am almost finished. This is Elster Creek, the paved section, just upstream of the reserve, and that's what it used to look like until some residents got out and planted some black wattles. That is what it looks like now. They've planted that side, and this has just recently been done. Just people, deciding that it would be a good idea. Now, since then, this is only about 5 or 6 years old, we've had Clara satin moths move in. We've had granny moths. Look at that juicy caterpillar. That is amazingly valuable bird food. Double-fringed emeralds, beautiful moths. And of course, after all that moves in, you get predators of those critters. And here's just a little sample of some of the things you can see on the night there in those leaves, which then attracts things like this. Those black wattles are actually crawling with marble geckos. We're talking about a thin strip, 1 tree wide, along a concrete drain, by the way. This is the difference that the right plant choice can actually make. Brown thornbills moved in about 2 years after the plantings, and they're now always there. Grey fantails now stop off there on migration every autumn and every spring, and actually it's the place locally where they stay the longest outside of Ripponlea Estate. It's the place where you can actually get grey fantails outside of just migration season too. There you go. That's what it sounds like over there now. That's a call that should be familiar to all of us, but the baseline has shifted and none of us have really grown up with it. We've grown up in the city, but it's something that we could bring back. Golden whistler, found a golden whistler in there recently, which is a really exciting turnaround. Now, that would be a surprise to you, but during lockdown, some kids pushed in some boulders, and suddenly there was habitat for common galaxias in that creek. It's that easy, which has attracted white-faced herons to a blank concrete creek. Just shows how doable all of this really is. If we were to do it on a bigger scale, we could have flocks of resident yellow-tailed black cockatoos, we could have sugar gliders, we could have all these incredible things back in our landscape again, and I think we should strive for that. Yeah.
Thank you all. Thanks for our speakers. That was a wild ride. I feel like we've come all the way up, all the way down. So we heard from Greg about why we want our urban forests. We heard from Jen about what we need to do to get them. And we heard from Gio about what plants we want there and what we could have back in our future. So we're going to have a Q&A now. Before we start on the Q&A, I just want everyone to take a deep breath, and we're going to take 2 minutes here. And I want you, if you have a question in your head, turn to your neighbour and talk about what you've learned here. Talk about the question you might have. Even if you don't know your neighbour, you can introduce yourself. Great opportunity to meet them, maybe someone you don't know. And talk about what, if you do have a question, whether that question, whether it's worth coming up and asking. Okay. What I'll do is, as we have our 2 minutes, talk to your neighbour again, and we're looking for questions, not statements. If anyone comes up and it doesn't have a question mark at the end, I will move you back down. So we'll get our 3 speakers up here and we'll get situated while you guys talk to yourself for 2 minutes. Talk among yourselves for 2 minutes.
A lot of information for developers for improvements as well, and some tools like the Green Factor tool that was developed by City of Melbourne as well to help greening of private developments as they occur. So what we need to do is we need to look at the range of incentives and really think about what works best. What works is a range of kind of sticks, carrots and tambourines essentially. So yeah, so if you wanted to, when you're looking at feedback for the urban forest, tell us about what incentives would work for you. We'd love to hear that.
Anyone else here with any thoughts on, Greg, thoughts on incentives or?
No, not really. I think the way I look at it is if you can get some assistance in managing your trees through the tax system, and they do that in other parts of the world, so that we expect people on private land to sort of maintain their own trees, but we get a community benefit. So my view is that you need to take a bigger picture view and look beyond local government borders to state and national mechanisms to provide what I would consider equity in terms of the cost of having trees on your property.
And Gio, any last thoughts? Yeah.
We're on.
Magic. Now, I note we only have Jen here for 15 minutes, so we're going to front load the questions for Jen, and then we can widen out as we go.
Hello, this is for Jen. Sorry about that. Why doesn't council support residents and owners revegetate nature strips using a program such as the one that is established in Perth, City of Vincent, where the council comes in, prepares the land, provides Gio Fitzpatrick's smorgasbord of species, and then actually helps maintain that. That's a proposal I've actually submitted to council, had absolutely zero come back on that.
Okay, so that's a really great question. Thank you so much. So what we've done, we've got nature strip guidelines. We also have a community greening officer who's available to assist people in advice on nature strips. We're developing right now some documents which have plant lists that are really good to provide on nature strips. The other thing we're looking at is more nature strip creation as well. So we've got a footpath renewal program which renews our footpaths when they come to the end of their kind of useful life. And as part of that program is we're working out how we can basically make less asphalt and more nature strips. But that needs to be in conjunction with the residents of the streets themselves, because we need residents to be assisting with the maintenance of those nature strips, because council, it's generally in Melbourne and really throughout Australia is that nature strips are generally maintained by residents more than councils, and so okay, thanks for that. Yeah, we did have a local law review kind of within the last 12 months. But yeah, look, generally residents maintain nature strips. That's pretty standard across Australia.
Anyone else want to tackle this as well, or should we move on? No? Next question.
Jen, I think I met you last week at Bothwell Street, part of the EcoCentre.
It might have been Megan, not me.
Megan, that's right. And I think she told me that it was about several $1,000s to keep a tree planted and growing. And I was just wondering whether the council budget for the Canopy development of Port Phillip and reaching the optimal target, whether that budget is increasing, decreasing. We're one of the wealthiest councils in the country, and I just wonder how much the council's putting into all of this. Do you know?
Yeah, so there are several different buckets which we use for tree planting and vegetation planting and for maintenance. So we've got budgets which is for infill trees. So say if we take a tree out because it's reached the end of its useful life expectancy, we replace it. We do lots of infill planting. We've also got a budget called the Greening Port Phillip budget. It's a line item in our budget that comes out every year, and that's been a standard line item, and that's a budget that we can use for lots of the really tricky plantings, as well as biodiversity projects and things like that.
For Jen, can we improve the selection, planting, watering and formative pruning of trees to help increase canopy? And is the City of Port Phillip considering a pilot undergrounding of power lines to see whether that actually costs less in terms of ongoing pruning of trees, and creates a net benefit for property values?
I'm going to pass over to our head arborist, Shane Hall, who's in the audience, to answer some of these questions.
Thanks, Jen. You've raised exactly the kind of things we've been doing for the last couple of years in species diversity and planting opportunities, and totally rescoping how we've been doing things. I've been here 22 months now, and it's been one of our action items. And we were a little bit siloed a while ago, so we were probably a little bit siloed a while ago. Bit of COVID, bit of change in staff, but we're working really hard to be collaborative and look at those aspects that we're hearing very strongly from the community. I'm really keen to work with the team across council. We've got some good ideas being massaged a little bit by community input. But I think we're going to be making some really good inroads over the next couple of years and seeing some really good changes to our practices. Yeah. The second part of the question, undergrounding. They're not our power lines. We are strongly encouraging all developments. I suppose, yeah. So we're strongly encouraging significant developments to have undergrounding the power lines out the front of their developments, and you're going to be seeing a fair bit of that through the Fisherman's Bend project, which is going to give us better chances. But that's, I suppose, the funding.
Roads,
yep.
Including the airspace and
yep.
the ground underneath.
Yep.
So they're existing in your property.
Yep. Well, I'm happy to spend your money in many different ways, but we can only do so much with so many different things, and
I'm suggesting a net benefit
Yeah, no, that is.
Yeah, so it is an absolute net benefit. So when we look at undergrounding power lines or electric bundle cabling, it costs $20,000 a span. So it's quite expensive. We look at prioritising where we can do that, but we also need permission to do that from the power companies as well. So the choice is not all ours.
With undergrounding, the Victorians have basically been sold a pup on this. Because what you look at, you always hear that it's too expensive, but they only talk about the installation costs. They never talk about the reduced maintenance costs, which was mentioned before, and they don't talk about the other benefits. And as a consequence, this should be an issue of major concern. It shouldn't really be dealt with at a local government level, because it should be happening right across areas where population numbers are high enough. And the interesting thing about this, I'm very optimistic about this, because ultimately the dollar speaks, and what's going to happen is every time there's a storm, there'll be people without power for a week. They put the old lines up and they get blown over again, they put them up again, they get blown over again. Well, eventually someone will work out if you keep doing the same thing and you expect a different outcome, you're bloody stupid, okay? And that's what we've been doing. So you've got to look at the big picture here in terms of undergrounding services. It's not as easy as you might think, because the space below ground is actually being fiercely contested, and in some places, because of the blocks of land becoming so small, companies, water distribution companies for example, which used to put their sewers and stuff at the back of the property, are now putting it at the front, so the nature strips on some of these new estates, the land below the street tree is even more hotly contested, and this has happened basically by stealth. So you're going to see fewer street trees in many parts of Melbourne because of this. But the point about undergrounding, the economics of this will win the day. We will underground because in other parts of the world they do it because it's bloody cost effective.
I'll also add to that in Sydney there has been enough push from the state and local governments to force some of those costs for aerial bundling, cabling and undergrounding back to the power companies as well. That's not something that we're seeing here in Victoria right now. It needs to be shared costs.
And so just following up on the first part of the question there, what about formative pruning, and what about the preparation for the ground, and that kind of early maintenance of the trees?
It's critical. We're really focusing on that.
Everything I've learned on that has come from Greg's work. So.
All right, next question.
Hi, question for Jen. Just picking up on your point before about you were talking about Canopy and it being ineffective in certain areas because of power lines and so forth. The precedent is established in the city of Port Phillip for planting in the middle of the road. I'm thinking of places like Elwood Shopping Centre, at the western end of Alma Road and so forth. Why don't we do that more often?
So we can do it more often. What we want to think about though when we introduce planting or additional planting into streets is where is that canopy going to fall? So depending on the aspect of the street and how the sun moves, it might be that medium planting is more effective for shading that street and those footpaths, or it might be that on the nature strips it's better. Definitely we can look at road diets and looking at transferring that grey to green as much as possible, and we're definitely considering that.
Sure, but shade isn't the only factor, of course. Gio spent 20 minutes talking about all the other reasons why we having trees.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's plenty of reasons to do it. I just think that that's a golden opportunity going begging.
I agree with
That's
you.
the spare real estate, and that's where the canopy is open above it.
Yeah.
In Europe, they've planted in the middle of roads, literally cut out, and they've stuck a tree in the middle of the road. You wouldn't get away with it here because, in the most part, Vic Roads and others would jump on you from a great height. But Vic Roads and others know that this actually works, and interestingly enough, it changes human behaviour. So it slows traffic more effectively than speed humps and signs and fines. So it's a very effective way of sort of getting some of the things we want in terms of a green environment, but also getting outcomes in terms of safety, safer access for kids to streets and all that sort of stuff. They won't do it here because many of those organisations are so strong in their engineering-dominated framework, they're not prepared to consider other paradigms. And we're a long way behind in this.
All right, thank you. Next question.
This is a question for the two of us. We seem to have the same question, which is why aren't we thinking roof gardens and vertical gardens? There's not enough space, especially with development in private property now, removing trees and making McMansions or whatever. So the land and the availability to plant trees is challenged. So, I mean, European countries like Germany and France have had roof gardens in big cities, which combats the heat island effect that Greg was mentioning and helps with the biodiversity that Gio was mentioning. We've got to think just beyond the trees, but have small shrubs and grasses. We could be doing that.
Is this a question? So what would it take? What would it take to get that?
Yeah, so the most roofs that we have is private development. So what we have at the moment is we've got agreement with the City of Melbourne to utilise their Green Factor tool. And what this tool does, you can look it up online, is that it looks at what a tree equivalent worth of green wall and green roof would be. So say if you've got, you know, like a large tree or two large trees, say if your development or if the planning scheme allows you to develop, you know, from boundary to boundary, so there's no space for trees anymore, what is the equivalent green roof and green wall you need to provide that will give the same benefits as that tree? And so we are having a bit of a soft launch of that tool at the moment and introducing it to developers with our municipality. City of Melbourne have just introduced it and put it into their planning scheme, so now it's a requirement. The other thing that we have to remember as well is that it's not just about regulation, it's about industry keeping up. And at the moment, in terms of green roof and green wall installation and maintenance, our industry has a way to go in that too. Absolutely, the more that we do, the more industry is going to be there and the more prices come down.
Thank you, both. Jen, you're very popular tonight. Can you stay for 3 more questions? And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Another question for Jen, I'm afraid, but a bit closer. We recently noticed that a lot of the trees that were taken down past the cemetery up at St Kilda East on Hotham Street were replaced with non-natives. And you mentioned earlier that a lot of your new young plane trees that you've just planted, why are we planting non-natives still?
Yeah, so, and totally acknowledge Gio's fabulous talk and the importance of Indigenous plants. We plant trees for a variety of different purposes. Sometimes we need deciduous trees. Sometimes there are trees with different shapes and characteristics that we're looking for when we're choosing. I can say we don't always get it right, but we are improving it. And tree species choice and palettes is really, really important. We've also got cultural legacies and heritage as well, which we also need to consider. I know that you're shaking your head there, but it's a reality that we do have significant heritage overlays, and landscape is a significant part of that. And character as well. So I think that on that, Council can do our part, and we can definitely up our game with Indigenous vegetation. I'm not saying it here now, we can do better. But also it's about community appetite for that as well, because if we change our planting palettes to more Indigenous plants, the fact is that it's going to look different. It's going to provide a different visual environment, and lots of people love it, but there's also lots of people that don't like it very much. So, but just this is the reality, okay? So we're here tonight because we are passionate about the environment and we're passionate about biodiversity, and we want to see a lot of this stuff, okay? Lots of our community really supports greening, but there are some people who really, really like European and heritage styles within our environment. That's the reality that we're in.
Just absolutely crucial to the sort of thing that Gio has been talking about?
Thanks, Greg. I'll follow on from that briefly as well. So, two subgenera of eucalyptus, monocalyptus and Symphyomertus. There was a study by John Wojnarski, and he found that Symphyomertus in his study had 6 times the abundance of lerps. So they're little sugary caps that are produced by psyllids on the leaves, and that's more than anything what drives noisy minor domination, is the abundance of lerps. They have 6 times more lerps than monocalyptus. And I decided to do a tally of planted eucalypts, and this really reflects what Greg's saying. Planted eucalypts through southeast Melbourne, counted 50,000 eucalypts, and 49,962 of those were all of one subgenus, the Symphyomertus, the one with all the lerps. Even though a lot of southeast Melbourne would have been dominated by narrowleaf peppermint and silverleaf stringy bark, which fight between people who love certain trees and people who don't necessarily, as long as we're both aiming for a healthy ecosystem. Yep.
All right, we're going to wrap through a couple more quick questions and then we'll get everyone home.
Jen, I just wanted to know what capacity has the council got, or is it doing anything to try to influence or require developers to put more trees on their land as they're developing it, and not trees and plants or green walls or roof gardens, but in particular trees?
Yeah, so there are some standard requirements within our planning scheme for tree planting. We were part of a planning scheme amendment, it might have been 2 years ago, that was put together as a group of councils through CASB to get better environmental sustainability, including green space. So there's that. You can read those in the planning scheme. It varies depending on lot size and everything, so I can't generalise on that. But also there's the green factor tool, which I mentioned earlier. What we are looking at with the draft of the open forest strategy is looking how we can really hone in on what vegetation we need where on private land, and start to make some really bespoke planning scheme amendments to be able to do that. So they're draft actions in our urban forest strategy.
Hi, thank you. The City of Port Phillip write a lot of reports regarding politics, urban forestry, etc. And they put a lot of money into these actual reports. Would it be possible if they could possibly pause a bit of the report writing and spend that money on the trees and shrubs for our area to try and get that 30% canopy? Is that at all possible?
Thanks for that. We spend a lot more money on tree planting than we do on writing strategies. What we do need though is data. Data is really, really critical because it helps us keep track of what we've got. It helps us plan for the future to make sure that we're climate ready, to make sure that we're planting the right species, and that actually takes a lot of time and effort. And so planning is critical for our urban forest, but I don't want to see any strategies come through that don't have really sound actions. I want to get plants in the ground and trees in the ground as much as you, but I want to make sure that we're doing it right so that we're successful.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to jump in with a quick question here. We've got 2040 as the target year. You can't make trees grow any faster. What's our window for getting trees in the ground to get to 30% canopy cover by 2040? I'm looking at Jen sadly, but actually this, what?
Look, it's an impossible question to ask. The thing I would say is if you don't have a target, you've got no hope of achieving it. So if you want to go above 17%, you need to have a target. Port Phillip is really going to struggle under the state government planning rules to achieve that target. And your officers know that as well as I do. And if you lose trees on private space, your public available space will not allow you to meet the target. And you can look at what happens in Sydney. There's a Sydney suburb called North Shore, where they had 30% canopy cover. So they signed off to a target that they'd already met, and their canopy has declined and declined. Council land, completely covered, no space for any significant tree planting at all. Public and private land being redeveloped at a high rate because it's so close to the harbour, and their canopy cover is declining. Your council can jump up and down as much as you like. There is no space. The state government controls the development on private land, and you're not going to meet the target. So my advice to you is accept the target in good faith and go for it as best you can in the hope that you'll get to 22% or 25%, because every time you go up, the benefits you reach are going to be really significant. So if you went from 17 to say 23%, that would be 1/3 more or less increase, and the benefits you will get will be enormous. But you are going to have a very difficult task. And indeed, the whole of Melbourne, every council in Melbourne that is under 20% is going to struggle to get to that 30% target, because there's not enough public land for them to reach that target, and they need the private land to get to a 30% overall canopy cover. But aspire to your targets.
Yeah, a couple of things. I mentioned black wattle as probably the most valuable plant in our context and what we're really missing. And it's also one of the fastest growing. So firewood cutters say that you can get a ton of firewood in 3 years when you plant a black wattle. And this is for the people who might be considering using them in their properties. You can buy one for $2 at a local Indigenous nursery and have a decent sized canopy tree within a handful of years. There's not many trees that you can get that benefit, let alone on top of it all of the biodiversity benefits too. So we could be thinking about using fast growing trees to fill gaps in canopy quickly. And also on the 30% target, and also on that target that I just introduced, just an idea, the 70% target for Indigenous tree species. We could reach that 30% cover planting only Indigenous trees from now on, and we still wouldn't get to the 70% Indigenous target. So there's a hell of a lot of room for improvement there. I would hazard a guess that we're probably at about 2% or less Indigenous tree cover. So that's discounting all of those non-native natives that I mentioned. So a long way to go in that regard.
If you look at black wattle too, just as a matter of interest, I've been studying it for a long time. It grows very quickly. Depending how you look at it, you get 20 years out of it. Sometimes only 15, but you'll get 20 if you look after it. It's an excellent tree because it's a nitrogen fixer, so it does wonders for the soil. And when they fall apart, the mulch is to die for. It's really fantastic mulch. And then when you look at the soil and what's living in the soil, Gio's mentioned all of the stuff that was in the canopy, but he also knows the diversity below the ground is enormous. So it's a pretty good choice, but you've got to think about how you use it, because it can grow quite large and it may not live that long. And so you've got to think about the cost of removal, where you put it. And it's also an excellent nurse tree. So what I mean by that, if you want to grow some of our other natives that are a bit more harder to establish, stick them in amongst some of the black wattle and do it smartly so that they're still getting good light, and they're a really good combination.
Jen, did you want to tackle the window?
So I think there's a saying, which is the best tree that we can plant is the one that we planted yesterday. So we know that we need to get trees in the ground as fast as we can, but we want to get the right trees in the ground, and also that lots of the sites that we have left to plant trees, they're really, really tricky sites. We've got an underground spaghetti of services, we've got driveways, we've got crossovers, we've got traffic. So it's not as easy as just going, oh, there's a gap, there's a tree. Chances are there's underground conflicts and overground conflicts and sightline conflicts going on as well. And that's just, our urban municipality. Doesn't mean that we're not going to do it and that we're not going to give it a red hot go though.
Thank you all. All right, we're going to take 2 more questions and then we're going to wrap up. So here we go.
Hi, my question to the speakers, I know our focus is on trees today, generally speaking, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on the value of other plant forms, so ground covers, their role in things like biodiversity, heat mitigation, and even things just like allowing grasses and lawns to be grown longer, their cause effects.
But very quickly on that, all plants, any green, is an advantage in terms of cooling and in terms of biodiversity, all of them, okay? If you want the really best outcome in terms of a whole lot of services, you have multi-layered, multi-storey. So you've got your trees, understory tree, mid-story or lower story, and then your ground cover. All of the studies on this have told you that will give you cooler, more carbon sequestered, more biodiversity. However, if you look at trees do things that certain other species can't. And some of that's got to do with size, some of it's got to do with transpirational cooling based on the size and the leaf area. And the other thing to remember is all of this also depends on what's happening below the ground. So if you look at a tree, you've got a shade area of say X, but you've got a leaf surface area of 3 to 4X. Okay, so the surface area of the leaves is much greater than the shade. So if that tree is transpiring because it's got soil moisture, then the cooling effect is much greater than just the shade. It's the shade and the evapotranspirational cooling. So in answer to your question, if you have places where you can put in a much more diverse community, you'll get a much better reward. But even sort of sporting fields will be cooler than non-sporting fields, as you could imagine. And the real villain in this, of course, is if you replace natural turf with artificial turf, but that's not for tonight.
Just a quick comment on that. So that structural diversity that Greg was just talking about there, one of the key places where we can get that in is on private land, in private gardens. That mid-story between knee height and say just above how tall I am, on streets and in lots of parks, it's really difficult to include that because of safety, so crime prevention through environmental design. Those sight lines are critically important for perception of safety as well as actual safety. It's important on streets and roads so that our kids don't get run over as well. And so there's limits to what kind of structures we can have in public space that aren't a limit on private land.
Gio, got a quick thought?
Yes, sure. I'll keep it as quick as I can and stop me if I don't. I would mention, just in regards to what Jen said, Jawbone Reserve is an amazing example of a classic open parkland that's 90% lawn, good sightlines, but a small bird haven. And that's because the lower structure in terms of shrubs that is there is extremely high quality structural refuge. In fact, a lot of it is too dense even for people to hide in and do dodgy things. And prickly often as well. So it doesn't harbour that kind of activity, but also it's actually very open in general, but it's effective. So there are decisions we can make around design that get the most out of that understory where we put it in. And also I would point out that even just that term understory implies there's always something overhead, but shrubs out on their own can be at times even more valuable than shrubs under canopy for various reasons. They don't grow leggy when they're all competing for light and that sort of thing. They attain a more dense, low ground-hugging structure, which is great for birds. But yeah, obviously, where space is limited in terms of actual footprint in the ground, trees are about the best thing you can do when you've got a little hole in a whole lot of impervious concrete. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Last question.
Thank you. So in context of looking at Melbourne as a whole and also in context of having separate green pockets and the problems with those not linking up, I guess a question to Jan again. I'd be interested to know what sort of communication and importantly competition is happening between the different councils of Melbourne all coming together so collectively we can strive for best practice in urban reforestation.
Yeah, so we do talk to our neighbours particularly Bayside and Glen Ira, where we're talking more and more and more, and we're trying to collaborate as much as we can. So things like, for example, we know we need to really have a look at our key habitat corridors. We need to link them up with our neighbours as well. So we're looking at mapping those going forward as one of our really urgent actions, and we'll be in touch with all of our neighbours to do that in particular.
All right, thank you all very much for the questions. Now, before you all get ready to leave, we're just going to let the council folks head out, because we have a resolution that we want to put to you as the audience here tonight. So I just want to thank Jen first. Let's give Jen she's on the front of our questions as well. Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, anyone else here.
Thanks for having us.
Now, again, we've heard so much from each of our speakers here. The urban forest strategy is going out for consultation again in a few months, so this is our chance as a community to give our feedback on the urban forest strategy. And what we've heard tonight is that we want more money spent on putting trees in the ground, and we want the right trees in the ground in the right places and planted as soon as possible. As they move out, though, we have a resolution which we, PECAN, wish we have population density as well, urban heat island impacts and access to public open space. Again, we have vast disparities across the city of Port Phillip in access to public open space in different areas. And that greening is, you know, a quasi open space for people. If they can go out and walk in the shade, it's not quite as good as, but almost as good as a park. And finally, as we've heard, it's important to tackle the private land challenges we have. So the last part of our resolution here is increase protection for trees on private property and require new developments to have open space setbacks, deep soil zones and canopy trees. So, after what you've heard, we would...
Justin, could I move an amendment in the light of the comments that were made by Gio?
Yeah.
Can I just suggest that we add in there that we seek to meet the targets being suggested for biodiversity?
Yep, a biodiversity of the tree species?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So we'll amend this with that in mind. Any other feedback or thoughts before we put this to a vote? So we will vote on this. We'll raise our hands to get your endorsement of this, to take any other thoughts before we do that? Okay. Can I see a show of hands for everyone who supports this? Was that a feedback down the back? We can hear the feedback. We've got...
If it's not too late,
yeah.
If they just put in baby plane trees or something unsuitable, is it worthwhile and cost effective to remove them and put some indigenous replacement in?
I think, well, there's a can of worms there about removing existing canopy, which will be detrimental to our where we're at the moment.
But
so,
if they've only just been planted,
oh,
which is what
well,
she said.
Yeah. I think that's probably on the implementation side. I'm happy to take that as feedback and feed that back to them in our engagement. I saw a show of hands there. It looked like overwhelming support. Everyone pop up your hands. Thank you all for your... I'm seeing strong... overwhelming support. Thank you all very much. We will put this to council. Thanks for your time tonight. Last off, obviously, thank you. Can I get one more clap for Greg and for Gio, who are still here?